Thanks so much for everybody who's hopping on and watching at the various campus watch parties that are going on across the country right now. To go ahead and kick it off, I'll introduce myself and say a little bit about the programming that we have in store for today. But my name is Owen Tanner Flomberg, and I am the co-executive director and co-founder of the Student Basic Needs Coalition. I will be hosting our event tonight on student debt. And in conjunction with, I know some campuses have been doing some programming throughout the last couple of weeks around student debt, as well as some campuses where this is your keynote event for your student debt related programming this month. We're really excited to be joined by two fantastic leaders within the student debt crisis. And we are joined today by Ryan Liebenthal, who's a journalist and author of Burdened, The Modern Student Debt Crisis and the Urgent Need for Change. And then we're also joined by Sabrina Cerceres, the Special Projects and Free the Degree Director at the Student Debt Crisis Center. So we're really excited to be joined by both of our panelists today and excited to talk about student debt and the crisis that we have in our country. This is often an issue that doesn't get talked about a lot on college campuses, despite how much student debt affects students and their futures. So really excited that for everybody tuning in, listening to learn a little bit more about what's going on with student debt and where we are as a country right now when it comes to this issue. So today we'll go over a couple pre-selected questions that we have for both of our panelists, and then we'll have an opportunity for participants and viewers to send in their own questions, and they can use the QR code that we'll show later in the presentation to submit questions and directly to us. So we'll go ahead and kick it off here with our first question. Ryan, in Burdened, your book, you frame the long history of college financing in the United States. Could you give us a little background on how the student debt system grew out of a bipartisan shift towards privatization of student debt? And I think you're muted.
Cannot escape that gaffe. In my book, I start with the GI Bill, which is potentially sort of a contrarian take, since obviously the GI Bill was not a loan program, but it was the first major involvement that the federal government had in supplying aid for students to go to colleges and universities. And that came in 1944, and it gave returning GIs a kind of tuition voucher that they could use at colleges and universities. But it was created for a very specific, to meet a very specific concern, which was that these flood of veterans were coming home and were going to potentially disrupt the labor market. And we had just come out of a depression, so there was some urgency to kind of getting these people out of the labor market. And FDR and legislators thought, well, we'll just park them in campuses. And they did not expect it to be nearly as popular and successful as it was. And so even though it was so successful and it spurred this huge appetite for generous education, for going to college, generous education funding did not kind of come in its wake. And so in 1958, President Eisenhower sort of followed up the GI Bill by signing a bill that created a student loan program, which would eventually be known as the Perkins Loan. And it was issued directly by schools and had a very low interest rate, like 3%. But then as interest in college continued to kind of explode into the 1960s to a point where, prior to the GI Bill, people generally didn't really think they could go to college. And by the 60s, people kind of assumed that they should be able to. And so the federal government was looking for ways to help particularly middle-class families pay for college, but they didn't want to add a big cost to the federal budget. So the solution they came up with was to have commercial banks make these loans directly to students, and the federal government would sort of backstop the loans, guarantee that they would be repaid even if the student didn't pay them, and add a subsidy for banks. Because at the time, actually, banks did not view this as a good investment because students don't have collateral. They're flaky potentially. And so the Johnson administration picked this kind of privatized form of a loan program because it seemed cheap on the books. You don't actually have to show the cost of the loan. You just show the subsidies and any eventual default payments. And so that kind of set the stage for this general view of student loans as like the primary form of federal aid to students, and of loans themselves as these private investments that are made by parents and students in themselves. And that idea was known as human capital theory, that you essentially literally invest in yourself and you're rewarded by material returns in the form of income. And so that kind of, keeps going, and into the 70s leads to an expansion in the student loan program with the creation of something known as Sallie Mae, which I think a lot of people have heard of. And in the beginning, Sallie Mae was this quasi-governmental entity, and it was supposed to buy up student loans from the banks, which would allow the banks to make more student loans, and then it could sell those loans on a secondary market, and it was expected to turn a profit. And so that kind of introduces this idea that not only is the loan program a form of aid because it gives low interest loans to students, but it's also a source of profit, and it should be a source of profit. And then in that same year that Sallie Mae was created, we also got the Pell Grant. So this kind of evening of the scales, which operated kind of like the GI Bill in terms of non-debt aid. And in the early years, that was actually very effective at funding student school bills. Students at public institutions might be able to pay their full freight just with the Pell Grant. But when Reagan came to office in 1981, his administration, somewhat like the current administration, was hell-bent on cutting the budget. And they basically decimated the Pell Grant while at the same time pushing loans through new options with punitive interest rates and ungenerous terms. And it's just kind of grown from there before really spinning out of control sometime around the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. So people tend to go to school in times of financial crisis to avoid unemployment and prepare for new industries or fields. And so within a few years of that moment, the total volume of student debt surpassed $1 trillion. And that was kind of a tipping point, or considered a tipping point. It became the second largest form of consumer debt after home mortgages. And now just, 14 years later, we're creeping up toward 2 trillion. So it continues to grow.
Wow. Thank you for giving that overview on like the history of student debt and student financing. One follow-up question to that is, I feel like often, myself included, feel really only coming at this from like an American perspective and think
Mhm.
that college has to be funded through loans, and that is just like the typical standard way of doing things. Was that always the case in American history? And are there models from other contexts, other countries that don't rely on private loans in the same way that we do right now?
So yeah, prior to this bill in 1958, there was no real federal loan option. So essentially, you had to finance education yourself, either through your parents' income, you had money set aside for you, or there were actually private loans that people could go to, individuals or even just their home bank. But like I said, banks were not particularly keen to loan to students. And otherwise, it was just kind of, there were scholarships, I think, but it was sort of up to you, the student, and your family. And that meant that prior to this huge expansion in higher education and who was sort of thought to deserve it or to be available to, not that many people did actually go to college. So, Harvard has been around since 1636, prior even to the nation. But at that time, it was really an elite group of people who could go, and it was supposed to be, the clergy, lawyers, doctors, leaders of the country, not the common person. And in terms of other models, in Europe, largely, there are essentially non-debt public higher education options. One of the places that I focus on, in part because I have a personal experience with it, is France, where, tuition is a few hundred euros a year. And when the president of the country tries to raise that, as Emmanuel Macron has done, there are nationwide strikes. And I have been there for some of these, and it is like everybody's on the street. And so I think that public funding model kind of encourages this other form of solidarity that we don't really have here, where students consider themselves in it together. And if tuition raises for one of them, it's for all of them. Whereas here in the States, it's viewed much more as, personal responsibility that you should go to a cheaper school or you should, get a different do a different major. And if you can't pay off your debts, that's really your fault.
Yeah, and so much less of it seems like feeling of, entitlement or that you're owed the ability to go and pursue your higher education that just doesn't seem to break through in the US beyond, a few states that have, larger, promise programs and things like that. Definitely go
Oh, I
ahead.
was just gonna say, I think there's a real conflict there because at the same time that you're told, you're not owed this, it's your responsibility. There's also this huge messaging, or at least has been up until very recently, that you really need to go to college, to be kind of prosperous and effective in society. You have to get a degree.
Right, right. And, I feel like there's a lot of talk about that right now. You know, you look at the polls and, there's a real shift away from that of people feeling like they don't need to go to college or it's not a good fit
Hmm.
for them. But still, ultimately, it is the best pathway to higher income potential and uh, still is a good investment, even though given some of the macroeconomic shifts that we have going on here in our country. And wealth disparity, even though it's not as helpful to have a college degree, it still is very much helpful over the long term.
Hmm.
Great. Well, Sabrina, the next question's for you. Organizing around student debt, the work that you do, often means pushing back against these narratives of personal responsibility that Ryan was just talking about. How do you, in your work with your organization, reframe those conversations with borrowers, with students, and with the public?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think it's not too hard to reframe that when you're speaking to students or borrowers, whether they're in school or out of school. If you speak to anyone who's taken out a student loan, they're probably going to tell you that they fully intend to repay that loan. They took it out with that, idea in mind. And while, we're letting 18-year-olds sign these huge loan notes, and they might not know everything that goes into that. It's not a common theme at all to meet someone who is just like, oh yeah, I got free money for college through this federal loan. That is not the narrative. I think it's really important though, yeah, to reframe that personal responsibility thinking to the public, to people who are not personally impacted by student loans or seemingly impacted, to the media, to lawmakers, anyone who can make a difference. Because we've heard it several times. We've heard that, people just want their loans forgiven because they want extra money to go on a vacation, or they want to buy an expensive car, or they want to buy another house. That is not the case. These people don't have a car. These people are living on their parents' couches. They don't have a house. Yeah, so that is really, where we go with reframing that, is really putting into perspective and putting the borrower stories first, and front and center, really exposing what people are going through, what sacrifices they're having to make every single day, choosing between their loan payment or food. That is the most common complaint and issue that we hear about through our website. The millions of stories that have been shared, everyone is, scrambling to scrape the bottom of the bucket just to afford that next meal, afford childcare, their rent payment. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, as a student loan holder myself, cannot even imagine, like I went to law school and have some of the higher earning potential from that. I can't imagine and it's tight for me often in my family. So yeah, I feel like it's kind of this in a lot of ways hidden crisis that a lot of people don't realize because on the surface, sometimes student borrowers, it looks like they're doing fine. That they have
Mhm.
that job with the higher earning potential, but at the end of the day, they're still struggling to make ends meet. Do you feel like kind of in our current era right now and under the new administration here, people are starting to better understand this issue, or do you feel like it's still a real struggle to get folks to kind of wake up to the crisis that we're facing?
Yeah, I definitely think it can still be a struggle. You know, you're always going to have that. It's like you'll always have that portion of the population who is just not involved in what's going on politically. And that's just humanity. You're never going to get 100%. But I definitely think like more than ever, we are making so many headlines. And we're not only making headlines, we are in memes on social media, in GIFs, and all these, viral things that are going around. We haven't seen that in like ever before, to be honest. It's really important to break that kind of wall. I think the social media aspect is really important because that's the channel that, young people are paying attention to. And honestly, young people, that's who we need to be paying attention to this issue because they are going to be the future. That is just how it goes. Unfortunately, too, I think, because they're being taught by all of us and all of people who are older than us who have made all those mistakes, and we're passing down all this information to them. So I do think that we are being way more successful in breaking through that wall right now and really getting people to wake up to the issue and talk about it, and understand how it impacts them, even if they don't hold a student loan, even if they don't know someone directly who does. It still impacts you. You're a part of this economy, a part of this country, and it's an issue.
Thank you. So for our next question here, this will be directed at you, Ryan. Can you walk us through a little bit about how the federal student loan program system really became a profit center for the government and for private actors? And what have been some of the consequences of that on both our society, the higher education system, and the way that we think about higher education?
Yeah, so I alluded earlier to the financial crisis of the 2000s. And at that time, the big banks began kind of cracking under the financial pressures that they were facing. They started to say, according to education officials that I've talked to, they started to say, well, we're not going to be able to make student loans. And that kind of created a panic within the Department of Education because by this point, 40 years after Lyndon B. Johnson started the guaranteed student loan program, which is the one most people use, it was at risk of failing. And at that point, schools had become so reliant on these federal monies that effectively you would be shutting down higher education in America if you take away that student loan source, which is kind of in itself a shocking thing to think about. And so the incoming Obama administration, outgoing Bush administration, incoming Obama administration started quietly buying up billions of dollars of loans from these commercial banks and putting them on the Treasury's books. They're basically acting as a kind of public Sallie Mae, encouraging the banks to continue to make the loans by giving them more liquidity. And just got rid of that bank-based program altogether. And he had convinced Congress to go along with it by promising that the savings from shifting from a private system to a federal system would pay for his healthcare plan. So that's really how we got the Affordable Care Act. And that effectively ended this privatized federal student debt system. But it left us in this kind of uncomfortable situation in which this system that had come to be viewed as a source of profit was no longer housed among people who have as their goal making profit, but now expected to generate that profit for the federal government. And that, I think, leads to and has led to all sorts of problems. For one, I think the need to make profit and to cut costs encourages the government to cut corners. So they contracted out loan servicing to, low bidder contractors who themselves don't really have an incentive to provide great service because they're paid for each loan they service regardless of the status that it's in. And I think that it has also, this profit idea has led to a lot of pushback to reforms of the repayment system to make, for instance, to make it more generous and less punitive, as we've seen with pushback to Biden's SAVE program, for instance. And similarly, it led to a kind of rejection of even the idea of loan cancellation. The Supreme Court squashed Biden's proposed cancellation program in part because they viewed it as too great a loss of federal money. But if you look at student loans as a form of aid, as they were originally intended to be, you see that they're not functioning effectively and the whole system is deeply in need of reform. And one thing I like to think about is that the fact that the majority of the debt that Biden would have canceled under that program is not anticipated to be paid back anyway. So, because the borrowers haven't seen those benefits that were promised to them under human capital theory, this notion that you'll earn enough to pay it back. And so instead of admitting that we're overseeing this failing system that actively harms students, the Supreme Court ruled that it's more important to hold to account or punish the individual borrowers by making them pay no matter what, even if that means going after wages, Social Security benefits, tax refunds, and so forth. So I think we're in this moment where the view of student debt, at least as conservatives are framing it, is very punitive. And I think a lot of that has to do with shifting to this idea that student debt is supposed to make us money rather than to help people go to college. So we've kind of lost sight, I think, of that aid part of student aid.
Yeah, and I know I saw in the news just, I think it was yesterday that the federal government is really going to start pushing for collections on student debt. Could you explain that a little bit to our audience who might not be familiar with what that means and how that's different to how student debt has been really treated over the past several years?
Yeah, so if prior to the payment pause that happened at the beginning of the coronavirus and lasted for basically 5 years. Prior to that, if you defaulted on your loan, which is 270 days without payment, there are all kinds of negative consequences that come down to you. And so those include having a portion of your wages garnished, having your tax refund garnished, going into your Social Security benefits, you report it to credit bureaus. And so that really dings your credit, which makes it harder for you to get things in your life. And also, there are consequences for your ability to access further student aid while you're in default. And then that was put on pause. And, so anyone who had previously been in default really didn't have to worry about it for that time. And anyone who is now, going into default, perhaps in part because coming off of a pause and going into repayment is both difficult and often very confusing. People don't always know that they're supposed to be in repayment. And there are very large numbers of people who are currently not paying and are delinquent. And so, yeah, we're going to see that kind of punitive enforcement again. And I think it's going to have a pretty negative impact on a larger portion of people than it did even before. And I will say, just kind of for a historical note, that really that kind of model started in the 70s when it wasn't then the Department of Education, but the Office of Education started really cracking down on people who were delinquent on their debts. And they were hiring dozens of collectors from collections agencies and making them federal employees. And like one point, some of these collectors pretended to be federal marshals and called people and made these, crazy threats against them if they didn't repay their loans. So this notion has a really long trail, and it's generally been pretty pernicious in our history.
Right. So there's a context to everything, and this is not the first time there's been kind of this crackdown on borrowers in this way. Great. So the next question that we've got is one of the most striking, and can be for both panelists here. One of the most striking elements when I was reading your book, Ryan Burden, is how the student debt crisis is really intergenerational, and like the impacts of policy decisions for the students in one generation has effects for years and years and years after that. How are different age groups right now experiencing this crisis? Because, I know it's like a meme, or I feel like people talk about this sometimes. It's, like my grandparents, they went to school, it was like $10 and they like were able to work just over the summer and pay that. But how are different age groups experiencing this crisis, and how does that complicate the advocacy that you do, Sabrina? And you can take turns with this one, whoever wants to go first. And then you'll see here we've shared the QR code. So for folks that are tuning in, feel free to scan this on your phone and you can submit a question and we'll take some audience questions here in a minute. But Sabrina, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Yeah, definitely a really great question. And it really does complicate things. I think in terms of I am by no means a policy expert, and you'll probably put it into a lot better terms than I can. But I think for us, we hear a lot of, the older borrowers or borrowers with older loans on our list, our supporters. They are retired. They have loans that are no longer given out. And that is probably the most complicated thing that comes with that is they have those Perkins loans or the Federal Family Education Loan Program loans, which is a ridiculously long name. And those loans are in need of a consolidation, or they don't have access to, or they're not eligible for certain income-driven repayment plans, or they didn't qualify for public service loan forgiveness, even though this person was a doctor for 40 years. It definitely complicates things for older borrowers. I won't even get into the technology feature there. Everything is online, and that just makes it extra difficult. And then for those who, are maybe just out of college or they are in their 30s or 40s, they're helping their parents right now with their Parent Plus loans that they had to take out, which is a whole other type of loan, possibly the least flexible, least eligible loan out there. There are just almost no options available for Parent Plus loans. So then you see, these people who are trying to start their families, start their careers, get promotions, move, really get settled in their life and start to take off. They're not only balancing their parents' Parent Plus loans that they took out on their behalf, but they're also balancing their own loans that they took out personally. And then we have students who, are just learning about all of this craziness that we've all created. And they're kind of in this weird limbo phase of, do I learn about this now? Do I worry about it later? Which I think all of you here, this is great that you're here. Learn about it now, please. So in terms of advocacy, it's definitely multifaceted. You have to understand where everyone's coming from. Are their wages being garnished? Is their Social Security being taken? Are they eligible for a repayment plan that's actually going to work for them? Can they even do public service loan forgiveness? Are they in repayment yet? It can make it difficult to mobilize people for sure. I think that's where that narrative piece comes in. Understanding all those different phases that can happen through the life of a student loan is really important. And just educating people on, how to take action during all of those different phases.
And I guess to piggyback kind of on what you're saying, Sabrina, just that although we view student debt as a young person's problem, and obviously that's kind of the growing block of borrowers in terms of there's always new students. At the same time, the fastest growing demographic is actually people over the age of 55. And there are something like 3 million borrowers over 60. And like you said, they've either borrowed for themselves, like getting a grad degree for a new career, or they're still repaying their old debts, which is itself a huge indictment of the system because if someone's paying student loans from the 80s, they really should have been able to pay that off, and something has gone wrong if they can't. Or like you mentioned, the Parent Plus loans, and I think not enough people realize just how punitive those are. The interest rates, unlike the lower interest rates of regular student loans, they're 9% or sometimes more. There's no grace period. You have to start repaying essentially as soon as you take out the loan, even if you're racking up more debt by continuing to pay for your kids' school. And then parents don't have that income expectation of, a 40-year career or whatever to be able to pay it back. So you see people just piling up debt with not really any hope of paying it off. And they don't have these cancellation or forgiveness mechanisms built in. And I guess, you know more about the advocacy side of it, but I was going to say that it seems like it would complicate things in terms of outreach because there are different messages or messaging packaging that go to older people versus students. And with students, they're concentrated in schools, so you can reach them on a larger scale, maybe more easily. But I think that the overall message would be the same, which is this is an unsustainable system. And I think that, older people in particular still live with this notion that student debt is good debt. That was something I heard when I was younger. And so a big task is sort of disabusing them of that. And I think younger people are farther on the road to realizing that, this is not necessarily a good thing for me, and maybe it's kind of a scam. And so I think older people need to be convinced that they are too part of a kind of predatory system, even if it's disguised as government aid. And then I think that having kind of that cross-generational ideological unity would make it easier to organize people than if it's just like entitled college kids who are looking to get out of their debts.
Right. And trying to battle that narrative, I just feel like it's so hard. But it's, I think, a little bit to what you said, Sabrina, it's like, look around. Who doesn't know somebody that has a ton of student debt and is struggling with that? I would venture to guess very few people. Great. So we'll do one more of our pre-prepared questions here, and then we'll hop into some questions based off of the audience. I think it's important for us to talk about how racial justice is impacted by the student debt crisis. I think it's hard to really have a conversation about student debt without looking at it through this lens. So this is a question for either of y'all. But how has the student debt crisis disproportionately harmed Black and Brown borrowers? And how should that shape how we advocate for solutions?
I can start here with just some sort of statistics, and that is that at least at the time that I was writing my book, some things may have changed, but Black and Brown students enter higher education with vastly less wealth than white students. So 1/8, I've seen different numbers that are even less, but at the time I was writing, it was 1/8. And so that really changes the options that are available to them. Either they have to choose less expensive schools than they are able to get into, or they have to take out more debt. And so typically Black and Brown students leave with about $7,000 more dollars in debt than white students. And then they enter a job market that pays them less. And so in many cases, they have to continue to credentialize just to reach the level that a white graduate would have with a bachelor's degree. And so that requires more debt just to, kind of even the scales. And then they also struggle more to repay that debt. So, 12 years out from entering college, 2/3 of Black borrowers owe more than they borrowed. And by 20 years out, the median white borrower has essentially repaid the vast majority of their debt, but the median Black borrower is almost at just the original balance. And so there just isn't a lot of progress, and it's definitely holding people back. And then I think another thing, by the way, a lot of that is true for women too. Just in general, women hold about 2/3 of debt while being closer to half of graduates, and they also face this kind of wage gap problem. But so the other element of this that we haven't really talked about is for-profit colleges. And for-profit colleges have been targeting Black students since the GI Bill, when a bunch of scam schools popped up and would go after Black vets because they were generally pushed into vocational or trade schools instead of university just because of racism. And so, you see this dynamic continue to play out over and over and over again with recruiters for trade schools going into Black neighborhoods, targeting marginalized and poor people at welfare offices, and then really not giving them anything. And that forces people into a kind of situation where been saddled with a huge amount of debt and they haven't been given anything of value. So I think that continues to be a real problem, that these predatory for-profit schools particularly go after Black students and then leave them in the lurch when it comes time to actually go into the workplace.
Yeah, I will say ditto to everything you just said. I definitely think that, yeah, it's a matter of position. That's where, a lot of the equity and opportunity and access is just not there for marginalized communities. And I will also give a shout out to Partners NAACP, specifically in Maryland. I work with someone there who does a lot of financial literacy classes for high school students, college students. I think the lesson there is that when you're coming, like you were saying, Ryan, from a family who is less likely to be able to contribute to your college education and fund things, probably know less about money than people who can afford to pay for college. And that is unfortunately a difference a lot of times between race. And so I think that that's really powerful work to be educating Black and Brown kids and graduates and community members about financial literacy, making sure that they have, that education backing them. Because I think, yeah, just right from the get-go is a completely unfair opportunity.
No, definitely. And I think the more that we can talk about it and recognize that, it's very constructive, I feel like, to these conversations and helping people understand the problem. So we'll hop into some of the audience questions that we have received. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but we'll try. So one of the questions that we got from a viewer is they said, as a first gen student, I feel like I was told to go to college to get ahead, but now I feel trapped by the costs. My younger siblings are watching me struggle and second guessing furthering their own educations. What would you say to students who feel like they're doing everything right, but they still are ending up in debt?
Yeah. That's a really common question. I feel like, and just conversation topic we get. A lot of the advocates in our space, talk about how community colleges get overlooked, certificate programs get overlooked. 100% there's that societal push to get that 4-year degree, to get a master's degree. And if that is what you want to do, then I encourage you, right? Like our organization would encourage you to pursue that. But also just don't forget that there are other options if that's not what you want to do. If you don't really want to go to a 4-year university, there are other options available to you. And honestly, get involved, change the system. If you are struggling to grasp what is going on, then I really encourage you to get involved and change it.
Right, yeah, it's a huge, huge problem, and not one person can solve it. It's we all have to do what we can in even the little ways to address it. And yeah, it's hard because, I know I think both of you have brought up this concept of, we view student debt as good debt because it's going to, as Ryan discussed earlier, increasing human capital, upping that earning potential. But that's not always the case anymore, given just larger structural changes to our economy. And that plays into the next question that we got from the audience is, how do you think that AI and changes to the job market generally, and we're kind of seems like right on the edge of some real systemic changes to the way our economy works and the job market works. How do you think this could potentially affect the student debt crisis and higher education more generally? Do either of you have any thoughts about that?
I don't know that I can speak to the AI part of it because I feel very confused about what's happening with AI, although it does seem like it's affecting professors. People are trying to use it to complete their coursework in a way that doesn't necessarily lend itself to actually learning or absorbing information. One thing that I think about and kind of thought through in my book was that just by asking young people, 17, 18-year-olds, just getting out of high school, they don't know necessarily what they want to do with their lives. If anybody really does, it changes over the course of your life. We're asking them at this moment where they have no resources financially, potentially, to play kind of the stock market with their lives. Take out this money and make a good choice. But, I think we've seen in short periods of time There are shifting trends about what is kind of a lucrative field. For a long time, there was that kind of joke of learn to code. And I think learning to code isn't necessarily what it used to be. And so it's hard to predict when you're 18 years old what, 4 years or God forbid 20 years down the line is going to be a valuable field to have studied. And I just think that that's very unfair. And that's part of the broader problem with this system is it does not account for serendipity, chance, bad luck. And I think, the way that things are going to change and AI's part in that will probably only make that more of a problem.
Wonderful. Yes, I think so too. And it's just further complicating and muddying the waters. And we're living in such an era right now of you can't predict anything that's going to happen tomorrow. And that instability cannot be good for folks choosing degree programs and trying to plan their lives out at a very sensitive time when a lot of folks are choosing to go to college.
I would
Um,
just add that it also puts people in this unfortunate position where they may have interests, and if they were given the option without so much pressure, they would choose to study different things than what they end up studying. And so it kind of goes against the very notion of what college is for, at least like the liberal arts notion of what college is for, which is to expand your mind and follow your curiosities and your passions. And instead, we have turned it into a thing that is just about making money.
Right, right. And, in this era where, we're having a lot of issues with our country and civic education and making sure that people know how to talk to people with different ideas so that we can work together to move forward, not having as many people getting degrees and training on how to do that because it is a formalized techniques on how to talk and communicate and debate that I feel like people are just not getting right now. Great. So the next question that we've got here is somebody asked, what advice would you give to universities to talk about this more internally with their students? Universities are in kind of a sticky spot here where, they're subject to the larger higher education market and the laws and financing systems that exist. But how would either of you suggest institutions can better communicate with students about debt and about some of the consequences it has on them?
Yeah, first and foremost, there should be a student in every room, every single table, at every conversation. Bring the student body into those conversations. And I'm in school right now at the University of Arizona, and every year they give us this email that's their budget. I have opened that thing. It's 50 pages long. It's gibberish to me. I have to have a finance degree to read it. No, that is not what students need. Students need to, have a real public-facing budget to look at to see what they're paying for, what percent of, their tuition goes to this and that, versus meal plans and dorms and all of that. And also just transparent about their spending. Where is the money going? What are you doing with the leftover meal plans money that you have? Change some of those policies, be more flexible. I think there's a lot of rigidity also in campuses and in their policies. It's been that way for forever, or they, like we're saying, they just want money. They need to make a profit. Yeah. I know we're talking about big companies and big organizations, but ideally, yeah, bringing the students into the conversation, seeing what they actually need, and really being transparent.
I guess I would add to that as well that institutions are often in a really conflicted place about this. And a lot of that goes back to the way that we do fund higher education on this individual level. So there was a time where lawmakers were considering and schools were really pushing for funds to go directly to institutions, funds to go more toward state federal partnerships, but we didn't do that. And so because schools are so reliant on money from students, they've had to create these whole systems to compete for those students by building up administrative offices, development offices, recruitment financial aid offices. And yes, students are not necessarily involved in those. And so the advice that the institution may be giving to students is not always in the best interest of the student. And I don't know how to give advice to institutions about that because I think that's just an incentive problem that they have, and that won't be changed until those incentives are reformed or go away.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, to sum up what both of you are saying is let's get some more transparency here. And the current system is not going to lead to the solutions that we need. There needs to be structural change. We're almost at time here. So we'll do one more question, then we'll close it out. We've talked a lot about a lot of negative things, about how things aren't working, how things kind of suck in a lot of ways when it comes to higher education and the funding systems that we have for that, and the systems that we set up for students at such a often a vulnerable age to make these big decisions that they don't really have any control over and have to operate in these systems that are not really set up to best serve them. Given all the things wrong with the system, I'm not going to ask you to say what's something good about what's going on because there's a lot of bad here. But I will ask on a lighter note, what gives you hope about the current generation or the current young people that are starting school or maybe graduating school right now, the folks that are listening into this call right now? What gives you hope about this generation being actually able to change the way that higher education functions in our country so that it works better for everyone?
Yeah. I think as someone who works with young people, everyone I meet is just so much more, I think, involved and motivated than I ever was at that age. That is what really gives me hope. And it seems to come, like, as you're saying, we've talked about a lot of negative things. It doesn't seem to come from a place where they feel like they have to be, paying attention to this, paying attention to that. It is just something that's natural. I think we've raised a generation and are bringing up generations that are wanting and motivated to be involved in their communities and curious and have really creative ideas. And maybe that's what's said about every generation. But yeah, we see so many advocates coming out of student groups, people who really want to make a change and people who are making a change. Just one person, just three people, just a handful of students who came together and actually made a difference in their communities.
I would add to that I think one thing that gives me hope, which is along those same lines, is that I think that as student debt has become a focal point in society and something that, is in a policy platform for presidential candidates, which was not the case even, before essentially 2016. There is a lot more attention to it and a lot more awareness of it. And I give credit to organizations like, Student Debt Crisis Center, the Debt Collective, which emerged out of Occupy Wall Street, for really concentrating attention on the issue and also for focusing on removing the shame that, kind of permeates this notion of having debt. I know that when I was going to school and grad school, I experienced huge amounts of shame about my debt. And I just don't think that people see it quite in those same terms. And that allows for a lot more conversation and a lot more advocacy, more effective advocacy too.
Wonderful. Well, I think thanks for that. I feel like that leaves us on a more positive note that, there is potential for change here. There is potential to get involved and push for these structural changes that will ultimately reform higher education in a way so it works better for everyone and serves the purposes that it, exists to serve. Not only just to train people for jobs, but to grow individuals and benefit everyone in our society, whether or not they end up choosing to pursue higher education. Because we all benefit when more folks are more educated and able to make those discoveries and those learnings and move our society forward. That's all we've got for you all tonight. We really, really appreciate both of our guests for joining us on our panel. We really appreciate all of the watch parties and all of the attendants at those for tuning in. And we will, one final plug, make sure if you're interested to get involved in this work, reach out. And I know that there's probably a way on Sabrina, your website for people to get involved.
Yes, you can head to www.studentdebtcrisis.org. Send us a chat. It goes straight to our email. We respond to everyone.
Great. And then make sure to check out Ryan's book, Burdened, and anything else you want to plug.
No, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, just, yeah, be involved, get as much information as you can about what's going on.
Yes, it's so important to be aware of this stuff and this big issue that I know a lot of you listening in are going to face personally, if not already. But really appreciate everyone for hopping on again and joining our call and our conversation here. And we will see you all later. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.